This is going to be sort of an advertisement for a paper that I recently posted on Academia.edu. I'm going to put the URL for that paper up on the screen. And then I'm just going to talk today about just a small portion of it. So this is going to have to do with Albert Pike, and I'm not going to present a biography of Albert Pike per se, although I'm going to quote from his own biographical sketch. You can look him up if you want to. There's all sorts of controversies surrounding this person. You may have heard of him. What I'm going to deal with in particular is the conclusions that I came to, and I'll just give them briefly without trying to substantiate them. It's in my paper and also in my books in more detail. And that is that we know that Albert Pike was a school teacher in Newburyport, Massachusetts, where he grew up. This would have been March of 1830 to March of 1831. And I have extrapolated that Matthew Franklin Whittier, that's myself in the 19th century, his future wife, Abby Poyen, who was 4 years younger than Matthew, took Pike's class. She was in that class. And when she was in that class, it so happened they had the same initials, AP. So Albert Pike plagiarized Abby's poems and became famous from them. So that's what I'm going to demonstrate today. Basically, I'm going to look at his autobiographical sketch, and I'm going to poke some holes in it. I'm going to look at the lies that he's telling in that autobiographical sketch. Now, this was written to Rufus Griswold. Rufus Griswold was the author of this book here, The Poets and Poetry of America. It came out in 1842, and then there were revisions subsequent to that. This is the 1843 edition, so it's substantially the same. It just didn't cost me hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And Pike was to be included in that because he had become somewhat famous for a series of poems he called hymns to the gods, and that was the Roman gods. Apparently, it was a class assignment. It certainly sounds like a class assignment. Anyway, he had become kind of moderately famous for that series, and therefore he was invited to have a little section in Rufus Griswold's book, his compilation of all of these poets and poetry of America. So each one of these starts out with a little biographical sketch, and then there's several samples. But of course, each person had to write in, or somebody had to write in and give a little rundown on their life, see, a little biographical sketch. So Pike did that, and it so happens that it was retained in Griswold's letters, his published correspondence, called The Passages from the Correspondence and Other Papers of Rufus Griswold, published in 1898. You can find that online. And it also happens that the Boston Public Library retained the handwritten original that Pike had himself sent in to Rufus Griswold. That apparently was donated by his wife some years later. So I have photographic copies of that, which I'll also show on the screen as I read it. It's kind of interesting because we've got him lying in his own hand, okay? We've got him red-handed, almost literally, see? So what I'm going to do is to go through this little autobiographical sketch and show you where he's lying, okay, and tie it in with the other things. We can get a little bit into some of the evidence as it comes up in this sketch, but there's much more in the paper. I strongly suggest you download that or access it on Academia.edu and have a look at it. Okay, so here's his sketch. We're going to start out. He says, born in Boston, Mass., December 29, 1809, father removed when 4 years old to Newburyport. My father was a journeyman shoemaker and worked hard, paid his taxes, and gave all his children the benefit of an education. From the age of 4 to 16, I was at school, partly in the public schools at Newburyport and a private school there, and last at Framingham. Now, I don't know about any of that. I'm not disputing any of that stuff. Presumably, it's accurate. You'll notice that he has a very specific idea of where he was when. He's got all his dates and places nailed, right? That's going to be important. About that time, he says from 4 to 16, about that time I entered, parentheses, passing a fair examination at Harvard. Now, so that would be when he says about that time, he's not real clear on when that was. He says, I do not now recollect in what year. Now, that's kind of odd. He's given a range from 4 to 16, and he says about that time, and he says, I don't remember what year he passed the entrance exam to Harvard University. But he has all his other dates, nailed down, and it goes on like that. So first, that's the first lie, I think, because it's impossible that he couldn't remember that. Now, there's two sources that I can use to pin it to August of 1825 when he was 15 years old. Okay, so we know it was probably August. I've written to Harvard. I haven't heard back from them yet. I'm trying to get them to look up the record, But anyway, it's impossible that he wouldn't remember if he had passed the entrance exam to Harvard at age 15, So he's lying there. I don't think he passed it. And I think the reason he fudged on this with Griswold is he didn't want Griswold having anybody look it up, and finding out that he actually failed. So he goes on to become a school teacher, see, and I'm sure he became a school teacher on the strength of asserting that he had passed the entrance exam to Harvard. So then he goes on, says, about that time I entered, passing a fair examination at Harvard. I do not now recollect in what year. I don't know what a fair examination is, as opposed to what? An unfair examination? I don't understand that. Anyway, he says, our funds, F-U-N-D-S, being scarce, I became the assistant teacher in the grammar school at Newburyport at age 15. I'm not clear about that. And after about a year and a half, which is age 16 and a half or 17, principal, is he a principal at a school at age 17? I don't know. Which I held some 3 months. Then traveled to Fairhaven, where taught an academy during one winter, then on foot to Newburyport, where I opened a private school which I taught for a year. During this time I had kept up my studies, always intending to have entered, and the Griswold puts SIC in brackets, at Harvard in advance. So here's another one. Apparently he has contradicted himself. He says he passed the exam and inferred that he entered Harvard, but here he says he was always intending to enter Harvard. So there's a question in his biography as to whether he ever attended at all. Apparently Griswold believed that he had and thought that he had misspoken when he said he was always intending to enter. Then he says, in March 1831, started off for the West by stage to Niagara, etc., etc. And then he goes on, and I won't read it, but he's very specific about his dates, November 28, September 1832, and, the places he went to and everything on his travels. So for him to have all that nailed down, and he's a young man now, to have all that nailed down and not remember the year that he passed the exam to Harvard as a boy, see, it's impossible. Now, if you back this up, if he taught at Newburyport for 1 year and he left in March of 1831, that means he had to have started in March of 1830. Okay, so remember that because it's important. That means we have a whole year from March 1830 to March 1831 that he was teaching school in Newburyport. And there was only roughly 3 months in Fairhaven over the winter of 1829-1830. Now we go down a little bit and he talks about his poetry. He says, I wrote the poetry which I published in my little book printed by George W. Light, whose name comes into this, partly in Santa Fe, partly in the mountains and prairie, and partly immediately on my arrival in Arkansas. Now, the hymns to God, which is a mistake, it was hymns to the gods, not hymns to God, as originally published in Willis Magazine in Boston. That is the American monthly magazine. He says, I wrote while keeping school at Fairhaven in the schoolroom during school hours. Now, the first of these hymns to the gods, and I don't have it in front of me. Hold on a minute. Okay, sorry, I like show and tell. I like having these things in hand. This is American Monthly Magazine of 1830. This is, says in the front, Willis's Magazine. You may be able to see it. And The very first from the Hymns to the Gods series appears in the August 1830 edition. Here it is, To Apollo, if you can see that. So we're talking August of 1830. If he wrote these poems in the schoolroom over the winter of 1829-1830, did he wait that long to publish them, the first one in August? I don't think so. I think that these were written when he was teaching in Newburyport. And he's lying about that. He doesn't want to admit that because he doesn't want anybody to trace it back to the student who he plagiarized this material from, which was Abby Poyen at age 13, and she would have been 14 at this point, see, when those were published. So it's a long story, but basically he was going through her private workbook and stealing and publishing her private poetry and her class assignments as his own. And since they had the same initials, he would submit them as AP. The editor, N.P. Willis, of this magazine believed they were his. He said he praised them to the skies. He compared them to Percy Shelley's poetry and said it was among the best ever written in America. That was little Abby Poyen at age 14, which gives you an idea of how bright she was and also gives you an idea of how plausible it is that she could have been the co-author of A Christmas Carol, as I've said she was. Now, he goes on, he says, To the Mockingbird, I wrote a day or two after my marriage. I have written nothing since, nothing of any importance, I mean, nor do I think I ever shall. What he means is he didn't write that either. He can't write poetry. See, he's no good. So the stuff he wrote later, Griswold had no particular interest in it either. See, so let's look at Poets and Poetry of America. Let's see what Griswold has to say about his later poetry, his other poetry, aside from Hymns to the Gods and a few others that he put in here that were also Abby's or somebody else's. He says of Pike, he still writes occasionally for the literary magazines, but none of his later poems seem to be equal to those which I have quoted in this work. Well, that's because Pike didn't write his early poems. He wrote the later ones or stole them from other people who weren't nearly as good, and so Rufus Griswold wouldn't even be bothered to put those poems in this book, see? But when he talks about To the Mockingbird, here's the one example we'll look at because he gives a date on this. He says he wrote it a day or two after his marriage. Now, in this autobiographical sketch, Pike says that he married on November 18, 1834. The historians have it as October 10, 1834. I don't know what the discrepancy is. Surely the man knows the date that he was married. But in any case, this is 2 years after it was first published. But there's a weird disconnect here. So let's see if we can kind of follow through with this. This is the poem Ode to a Mockingbird in the July 1832 Essayist. It's called The Essayist. It's edited by his friend, George W. Light, who published one of his books. Matthew has a very heavy presence in here. He's writing the book reviews as a star. He's also writing as Franklin Jr. So Matthew is heavily involved in this. Abby's poems appear here. One of them is unsigned. One of them bears the editor's initials. Some of them are signed AP. They're all Abby Poyen's. Later on in 1851, George W. Light plagiarized, published a little book, which I also have in here, called Keep Cool. Here we go. I might as well get this one too. It's called Keep Cool, Go Ahead, and a few other poems. The few other poems are by Matthew and Abby Whittier, taken back from this early era. This is 1851. He's stealing and revising and reworking poems that Matthew and Abby wrote back in 1832, probably, including the one that is unsigned in The Essayist and including one that has his initials on it. So there was a feeding frenzy of men stealing, a couple men anyway, stealing Abby Poyen's work when she was just a little girl of 14. See, that's how brilliant she was. Now, this poem, Ode to the Mockingbird, this is definitely Abby Poyen's work. I'm going to read it to you in a little bit. It's no doubt a class assignment, probably to write in the style of Ode to the Nightingale or something along that line. She made it something completely different. She wrote about the contrast between the city that men have created and how awful it is. And she compares that to the bird in the forest, the innocence and beauty of the bird singing in the forest compared to the cities of men. See, that's her theme. So Pike didn't write that. And technically, he didn't claim to write that because that's called Ode to the Mockingbird. What he claimed to write 2 days after his marriage was To the Mockingbird. And it's definitely the same poem, totally rewritten. But you can see that one is drawn from the other. Now, you could technically say that he just sort of neglected to mention that he didn't write it from scratch, that he reworked it from something earlier. So let's look at that. This is called Hymns to the Gods and Other Poems by General Albert Pike, because he became a general for the Confederacy in later years. This was published by his daughter in, I think, 1899 by Mrs. Lillian Pike Room. And there's both of these poems are in here. The original one that was written by Abby and the one that he reworked for his wife, apparently 2 days after their marriage, probably to impress her with his great sensitivity and his ability as a poet, see? But she's got the titles switched. So here on page 98, she has Abby's title, Ode to the Mockingbird, but this is actually the poem that Albert Pike reworked and rewrote 2 days after his marriage. And it's on a totally different theme. Now he's writing really about the mockingbird as a mocker, and he says his opening line is, "Thou glorious mocker of the world." See, so that was what he originally intended, I think, when he gave the assignment, and Abby refused to do that, and she wrote about something completely different. And this is the pattern that I've seen, that Albert Pike was a worldly, kind of crass fellow, and really a sociopath, I believe, and he would give these assignments, trying to get his students to go down a particular kind of a dark, worldly path, and Abby refused to do that, so she would turn them and make of them something spiritual. And it became like a battle between them where he would literally give her the last one was a picture of a battle scene of one guy killing another guy. And she turned that into something spiritual, see? So this is what we're up against. It's like a battle of good and evil, where good was only 14 years old, but she's prevailing. But by trickery, Albert Pike stole all her poetry and claimed it for himself and became famous from it. So here on page 138, the title is the one that Albert Pike claims to have written after his marriage, To the Mockingbird, but it's actually, this is Abby's poem. This is the original 1832 with some slight variations. Okay, so his daughter, when she printed all these in the compilation, swapped out the titles on these two poems. Now, in what she calls Ode to the Mockingbird, which is Pike's reworking, she has given the appropriate date of 1834. On the other poem, the one that Abby originally had written and what appeared in the 1832 essayist, she's giving the date 1828. Now, there's no evidence that I know of that Pike wrote this poem in 1828. I don't know of anywhere that he says he wrote it in 1828. I don't know of any manuscripts. I think she got that from him, and he lied about it to make it look like, in other words, he had to do damage control. Maybe he didn't know that it had been published in the essayist, didn't notice or something. So he had to pretend that he had written it in 1828, and that's why that date is on there, so far as I know. I could be wrong. There could be some evidence that proves that Pike wrote it in 1828. I seriously doubt it, because I'm 100% certain that that is Abby's poem and not Albert Pike's poem. Albert Pike was a sociopath. He didn't have a social conscience. Let me go ahead and read this to you, or at least the first couple stanzas anyway. O bird who dwellest, this is Abby's poem now, in the essayist. I'm reading directly from the original source. O bird who dwellest in the lonely woods, far from all cities, where men dream of life, walking with blinded eyes, and dull care broods upon their withered hearts, and angry strife flaps her broad wings before the eyes of men, and gnaws upon their souls, and avarice halts out from his gold and misery piled den, and grasps men's souls with yellow shriveled hands, and shrinks them up, and filthy gods exalts to proud dominion, worse than pagan lands have ever bowed before, and, clutching handfuls up of glittering ore, he makes of it, oh wonder, strong, firm bands to bind them to his sordid service and cursed lore. Thou knowest none of this. Thy home is in the thick-leaved trees, and there thou hast thy nest, where the leaves whisper with a quiet din, and hardly moving airs may cool thy breast. And there thou fillest with many a tune the wood, singing unto the giant forest trees, and waking up the quiet solitude, sending about with never-ceasing flow a different strain on every changing breeze, running about as leaping waters go through every merry change, and making men for thy wild wondrous range stop in their journeying, that they may know what emulous wild bird pours forth a song so strange. That's little Abby Poyen, the child prodigy. That is not Albert Pike, okay? So that's just a taste of what's in that paper. And the paper is just a taste of what's in my books. But again, I'm going to put the URL up on the screen. I highly recommend that you read that paper. It's about the length of a normal academic paper, not too terribly long. It's under 10,000 words. I have no intentions, as I sit here today, of ever submitting it, because I've had 21 rejections over the last year or so from scholarly journals, and I'm fed up with them. They're a bunch of ignoramuses, and they're all in denial. And I'm about ready to call them penguins, the way that I think it's Sylvia Ivanovich, who does the archaeological historical research. She calls academicians penguins, and I'm about ready to follow suit with that because I'm up to here with them. But read the paper.